Today we're going to talk about the difference between rectangles, rhombi, and squares. What we're hoping to do today is to be able to look at a quadrilateral and determine if it's any of these shapes by the properties that we see indicated on the shape. So with a rectangle, we know that this is a shape that has 4 right angles, and that's going to be marked by these boxes in the corners. We also know that the diagonals are congruent to each other. And then the diagonals bisect each other, meaning they cut each other in half. So these two parts of the diagonal would be congruent to each other, and these two parts of the diagonal would be congruent to each other. Lastly, with a rectangle, we know that opposite sides are congruent to each other. So that means that these two sides are congruent to each other, and these two sides are congruent to each other. With a rhombus, one of the most distinct properties is that all 4 sides are congruent to each other. So this is different from a rectangle because in a rectangle, the opposite sides are congruent to each other, but in a rhombus, all 4 sides are congruent to each other, so they're all the same value. We also know that the diagonals are perpendicular, meaning they form a 90-degree angle where they meet, and the diagonals bisect the opposite angles. So that means that, for example, if we're looking at this angle here, where a diagonal is, that means that it would cut the angle into 2 congruent pieces. All right, so each side of that angle would be congruent. Same could be said down here. These are congruent to each other. The biggest property that we are going to focus on is the fact that all 4 sides are congruent. Lastly, we have our square. Now this is kind of a hybrid between the rectangle and the rhombus. So it has all the same properties as a rectangle and all the same properties as a rhombus. But the biggest pieces that we look for are the 4 right angles, like from a rectangle, and the 4 congruent sides, like from a rhombus. So if something's a square, we can also say that it's a rectangle and a rhombus. So a quadrilateral can be grouped as more than one kind of shape. We can call things quadrilaterals, but there also can be rectangles or rhombi or squares, and then there are also rectangles and rhombis. So there's many different ways we can classify these shapes. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at each of these shapes and try to classify them into as many categories as possible. Now remember that because all of these have 4 sides, they are all quadrilaterals first. Then our other shapes are rectangle, rhombus, and square. Now I'm going to write in here the key things that we're looking for. Now with a rectangle, we're looking at opposite sides being congruent, and we're also looking for 4 right angles. With a rhombus, some of the key things that we look at are all 4 sides being congruent. So that's one of the big indicators for a rhombus. And then the square, what we're going to look for are the 4 right angles and we're also going to look for the 4 congruent sides. Now remember, if we see that we have a square, that also means that we can call this a rectangle and a rhombus. All right, so I'm going to look through this first shape, and I see that my opposite sides are congruent. I also see that I have those 4 right angles. So that means I'm going to have a rectangle. Now again, this is also considered a quadrilateral. All right, so this shape would be a quadrilateral and a rectangle. It would not be a rhombus because we do not have all four sides being congruent to each other. And it would not be a square because, again, we're missing that part with all four sides being congruent. This next shape, I see that all four sides are congruent because they all have the same marking in their sides. And I also see that I have the 4 right angles. So I'm going to look here, and that's going to tell me that, well, I must be talking about a square because I have the 4 right angles and the 4 congruent sides. So I'm going to call this a square. And then because it's a square, it's also a rectangle. And because it's a square, it's also a rhombus. And then all of these, because they have 4 sides, are quadrilaterals. All right, and this last one here, we have, I'm just going to call it our quadrilateral first because we see that it has 4 sides. Now I see that we do not have any right angles. So right there, that cancels out the idea of a rectangle and it cancels out the idea of a square. But I do have 4 congruent sides. So if I have 4 congruent sides, that means I have a rhombus. So these are the key characteristics you're looking for in each of these shapes. I would make sure you focus in on these essential things that we've highlighted over here. Remember that if you call something a square, it is also a rectangle and a rhombus. And all of these shapes that we were talking about are quadrilaterals because they do have 4 sides.